This video just came out a few hours ago and shows Russian forces planting the flag at the Sudza checkpoint, which is essentially confirmation that Russian forces have almost entirely pushed Ukraine out of Kursk. I mean, this specific checkpoint was kind of the main crossing point from Sumy in Ukraine into Kursk in Russia. So today what we're going to do, now that there's only a few small pockets left of Ukrainian forces in Kursk, is look big picture that operation and see, was it worth it? Did it achieve its desired objectives? Now, to start out here, I do want to pull up a map to show you the area that we're looking at. There's actually a key difference between a couple maps we're going to use today. I'm going to start with Suryak map because this is, in my opinion, they do a better job of updating this in real time. So all of these sources will be in the description below, but we're zooming into the Kursk area here. This entire red portion at one point was generally held by Ukrainian forces. It's kind of the limit of their advance. About 7 months ago. Slowly they were pushed back, and then pretty rapidly just in the last 2 weeks. But as of this recording, the afternoon of March 27th, we see right here is the Sudza checkpoint. And you'll see that that is now showing up as red on this map for Suryak maps. Now, there are still, even according to this map, a couple different areas still inside of Kursk held by Ukraine. And of course, as we've mentioned in recent videos, we've got this area down here in Belgorod, where even according to Russian sources, there are still Ukrainian elements in and around this Demidovka area and further south continuing to hold on. I don't think I would necessarily say that they're advancing at this point. But zooming in here, I want to show you a difference in two maps. We've got Suryak map here showing that clearly this checkpoint is now under Russian control, which we can confirm because we have the video footage of that earlier today. But if we go over to Deep State map, which I actually prefer this one because I think it's easier to read. I think it's a little cleaner, simpler on the eyes, if you will. But as a comparison, it shows this area still being under Ukrainian control. So I've said in multiple videos, this doesn't really matter big picture for all of us. We're not making real-time battlefield decisions. So if a map is a day or two late, honestly, doesn't make that big of a difference. But this is one of the rare circumstances where I feel like we can actually show the difference. And this isn't a matter of opinion. The Deep State map has not yet been updated based off of relevant video footage that has been released. Now, in terms of whether or not this Kursk operation was successful, there's a lot of different ways we can look at this, and it's very hard to judge in the moment. As the operation is ongoing, it's still very, very hard to judge as it's coming to a close where we sit right now. It'll get easier as the years go on, and this is definitely something you'll be able to look back to as whenever the war comes to a close with better perspective. But this is probably the clearest view we've had since this operation began 7 months ago. And it was controversial when it began. If you remember, when Ukrainian elements first moved into Kursk, guess who didn't know about that? Us, the United States. Our Ukrainian friends decided after the summer offensive and how some of that information came out before execution, maybe sharing some of this surprise attack information with the United States wasn't the best bet. So we were actually caught off guard here in the U.S. But what I'm going to lean on today for a source here is Tatarigami. He works with Frontelligence Insight. He's a former Ukrainian reserve officer in the Ukrainian military. He's in Ukraine now, I believe, and he puts out incredible assessments on the battlefield. They just did a big one. I'm going to link this in the description because it's incredible. But diving into the details of these Ukrainian deep strikes and the impact they've had on Russian oil infrastructure across the country. It's an incredible analysis, so you'll want to check that out. Maybe we'll do a video on that one, but I'll link that one and this original source in the description below. This was their preliminary assessment of the Kursk offensive, and there's a couple key things I want to call out here. First off, they're talking about what exactly were the objectives, and that's been a challenge throughout this war. It's not always that clear cut of we want to take a village, right? There's always multiple different aspects to what the starting objectives are, and we've seen both Ukraine and Russia do this, and it's understandable. The objectives kind of change as the operation goes on because nobody ever wants to say, hey, we didn't do that. We didn't meet our objectives. There's losses, certainly on both sides, so they shift a little bit, right? So we have to take that with a grain of salt. But looking at what are the overall objectives for Kursk, the biggest one they highlight, and this is kind of where I've stood from the opening of this front, they said first was the diversion of Russian forces from the Pokrovsk sector. And Pokrovsk was backpedaling fast when this operation kicked off, and that seemed to be the most likely explanation. The other ones here that were thrown out there was to create a buffer zone to disrupt Russia's attempts to seize Sumy, as in there may have been some sort of Russian offensive operation planned there. I The authors in this piece push back on this, and I would as well, because it doesn't really look like that was in the cards. We saw Ukrainian forces move into Kursk, and they did not run up against, mechanized Russian divisions or even motorized divisions getting ready to push into Ukraine. They ran up against conscripts and border guards, many of whom ran at the first sound of gunfire. So to me, it did not look like an invasion there was imminent. The last piece here that also I think holds some weight is to use as some sort of leverage for negotiations. And we are still talking about that today. I'm bringing that up today because I think that's still important. If you look in Russian media, Putin and his senior leaders, this is a major thorn in their side that Ukraine has any territory in Kursk at all as we enter these negotiations between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. So there's some weight to that as well. We would just have to take a guess to determine which of those was the priority or the most important of the three. Now, something else that Tatarigami threw in here was the effect on morale. At the time the operation kicked off into Kursk, the Ukrainian morale was generally deemed to be low. They were on the defensive everywhere across the front. They had not kicked off any serious major offensive operations in quite a while. They were defending. And in most places they were defending, like Pokrovsk, they were falling back. So one of the arguments here was it was a boost to morale, and it most certainly was. We saw that across Ukrainian media and Western media in support of Ukraine, and it was embarrassing for Russia. It has been this entire time an embarrassment to Russia that Ukraine was able to do this and stay there as long as they can. But morale is very difficult to measure. So as they call out in this article, they say, one thing we can measure is recruitment numbers. And when looking at it from that sense, recruitment for Ukrainian armed forces since the beginning of this Kursk operation didn't materially change. It's about the same numbers that they would have expected either way. On the Russian side, however, there was a spike. There was a definite increase, and Russia used this Kursk operation as propaganda, as marketing, saying, hey, look, there's Ukrainians on our territory now. Sign up to fight to defend your homeland. And it worked. So the morale argument, while certainly one that can be made, I think there's a fair defense that it might have actually helped Russia in that sense more than Ukraine. Of course, very difficult to measure. The biggest one here where we actually have tangible results we can point to is attrition. Now, we're going to focus in on the vehicle aspect. That's the one that I think really tells the best story here. Of course, personnel are more important. The soldier is more important than the vehicle. It's just vehicles are replaced much easier, much faster, much cheaper than people, especially when you're talking about modern, high-end military equipment. The challenge, as everybody knows who's been following this war, is coming up with accurate or reliable casualty figures is next to impossible. So the figures on both sides in this fight in Kursk have been all over the map. And if we're going to try to compare one-to-one, we're not going to be able to compare one-to-one because, quite frankly, the casualty figures are so out of whack from the two sides, and we don't have verification. So it's a trust me type situation. When we shift over to the vehicles, we actually have we've got receipts, right? We've got videos and pictures showing certain vehicles, and there's been some incredible open source intelligence groups that are tracking these day by day. Oryx was kind of the big first one, right? And there's been others that have kind of come in since then where you have to have video or photo evidence, and they confirm that's the first time we've seen that tank in this position destroyed. That's one more Ukrainian or Russian tank destroyed. That's what they're going off of in this assessment. I think it's actually pretty useful. So what they point to is that essentially in Kursk, this was a 1-to-1 loss ratio in terms of equipment. A 1-to-1 loss ratio is a problem for Ukraine. Full stop. That is not an attrition rate that Ukraine can sustain short term, let alone long term. Okay? Ukraine does not have the ability, they do not have the back order, the stockpiles of equipment that Russia does. It takes them longer to get them in because a lot of them are coming from their foreign partners. And Ukraine has a limited ability to replace those losses domestically. Whereas Russia still, even though we've seen some waves in their defense industry, they are still able to replace and repair these vehicles and push them out to the front. And that's on top of these crazy Soviet stockpiles that were sitting around. So a 1-to-1 equipment ratio, at no point in this conflict would anybody ever say that favors Ukraine. That favors Russia. And that appears to be what played out in Kursk. So looking at the data here, they say overall, Russia lost more than 712 pieces of equipment, with 412 armored fighting vehicles accounting for the largest share, far surpassing losses in other categories such as tanks, engineering vehicles, and transport. Then shifting over to the Ukrainian side, they say Ukraine's total losses at 632 are lower than Russia's and are more evenly distributed between infantry mobility vehicles and armored fighting vehicles. However, there's a caveat here. The data set that they are using for this, and the author calls it out for what it's worth. This is not me layering an exception on. They mention this in the piece. The cutoff for these vehicle losses, the data set ended on March 10th. Data became much more difficult to come by, much more sporadic, and it started to come from a lot of different sources because that date there, March 8th, 9th, 10th, is when Russia really kicked off their major offensive to try to seal up the Kursk pocket once and for all. Now, what we have seen in the footage that's come out since then is a lot of Ukrainian vehicles that have been destroyed, damaged, abandoned, captured. Like, that is what the footage is showing. Certainly some Russian vehicles have been destroyed in the process as well, but we'll play some of the footage here. Russia has been very excited to show off just the volume of destroyed Ukrainian equipment that they're coming across as they are closing out this Kursk pocket. So if on March 10th, Russia had lost, according to this analysis, 80 more pieces of equipment, it is not a stretch to say that that number reached parity by today. So we're essentially looking at a 1-to-1 loss ratio, and it's entirely possible based off of the volume that Ukraine lost during these last 2 to 3 weeks in Kursk. It might have actually been, the ratio may have skewed entirely in Russia's favor. So when looking at this, and I think that's one of the best assessments overall here when looking at trying to compare losses in what is largely viewed as a war of attrition right now all across the front. And that's been the argument, right? When you see that Ukraine in any areas of the front is moving backwards, but slowly, the argument there is, well, they're inflicting heavy losses on Russia. And in much of the front, that is true and has been true from the start of the war. They're inflicting significant damage on the Russian military for Russia to advance 1 kilometer over the course of a couple months. So the attrition conversation is important, and we have the data here. Now, the conclusion that Tatarigami points to here is he says, quote, "The operation could have been one of the most successful of 2024 for Ukraine if it had been conducted as a raid with a planned withdrawal by September to early October, leaving behind a buffer zone reinforced with minefields, with the overall Russian manpower advantage across the front remaining unchanged at approximately 2-to-1, meaning the Kursk operation did not achieve resource deallocation. Thus, manpower disbalance in other sections of the front remained. The initial successes, including the capture of a large number of POWs, intelligence gathering, and disruption of logistical routes, were largely accomplished in August. Beyond that point, Ukraine was engaged in a battle of diminishing returns." I'm going to go back to the map here and show you kind of the area that he's talking about. We'll use Syriac map. So the suggestion there from Tatarigami, and I think it's an accurate assessment, is this was very effective early on. Put the Russians on their heels. They had such a hard time. It was interesting seeing how challenging it was for Russia to mobilize resources and actually move them to this region to try to push Ukraine out. And, this is the area where we got the first footage of North Korean soldiers actually entering the fight. That's a major, tipping point in this conflict. That is something that we very well might look back on years down the road and say that right there was a significant change in this war. We started to see uniformed personnel from another country, albeit kind of hidden in this case, show up on the battlefield. That's significant. There's no two ways about it. But what Tatarigami's getting at here is there was a point somewhere there, relatively early, on or about August, where they had scattered the Russians. The Russians had retreated. They were in disarray. They had not formed any sort of coherent response to this attack. And at that point, if they would have just mined some territories, maybe thrown out the occasional drones, kind of turned it a bit into a buffer zone and made Russia advance through these minefields under the watchful eye of Ukrainian artillery and drone strikes, they would have lost fewer Ukrainian soldiers, less Ukrainian equipment, and possibly could have achieved the same general results. I mean, under that argument, it's entirely possible that Ukraine could have turned, 1 or 2 kilometer stretch of Russian territory into a dead zone, with just the volume of drones and landmines placed across that. And then technically at that point, Ukraine still does control some Russian territory. They just don't actually have boots on the ground. So I think that assessment from Tatarigami is pretty spot on there. But again, this is kind of the first initial assessment, I would say, of the Ukrainian Kursk operation. I think it's pretty spot on, but as we get further and further from the completion of this, which is not over, there's still Ukrainians in Kursk fighting right now, the further we get, the more objective we'll be able to be on exactly what was accomplished and was it worth it. But again, all of the sources used in today's video will be linked in the description below. Be sure to go check out Tatarigami. They've got a free newsletter on Substack, Awesome guys doing really, really important work. There's a paid section as well. I'm a proud paying member of their work, but I know that's not for everyone. So at least sign up for their free newsletter. Give them some more attention because they're an invaluable resource, I will say. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.